Hey guys, so here's where we are. We've interviewed somebody, we've turned it into a map. All of that information has become a mind map. We took the information from that mind map and we turned it into 3 body paragraphs. And that's where we are right now. Remember these guys right here. The beginning of the story, the middle, and then the end of the story. Before the thing happened, the thing that happened, and then the aftermath of that thing happening, okay? Those are the body paragraphs. The body paragraphs, in a way, kind of write themselves because really gathering information is most of the work for body paragraphs. In this case, gathering the information meant interviewing somebody and getting somebody's story. So that part's pretty much done, hopefully. Now, today, I want to focus on these 2 paragraphs, the introduction and the conclusion, okay? And I want to go over this entire structure, this map that I keep using that you're going to see again and again for the next couple of weeks, because it has a lot to do with how these pieces fit together. And it has a lot to do with what these pieces actually do. All these pieces have a job. They have a specific job within an essay, within that essay format. And so these shapes aren't there just because they look neat. There's actually some meaning behind it. So for starters, let's talk about this guy, the introduction. Now, people will often say that they find the introduction to be the hardest paragraph to write. And I would agree with that. I think it is. But I also think it's the most fun to write. And here's why. There's no set formula for how to write an introduction, okay? It's the one place in an essay where you really get to be you. You really get that opportunity to put in whatever amount of creativity you want to, whatever your writing style, your personality. That's the one paragraph where you can kind of go nuts and just put that in there, okay? A lot of it has to do with the information that you're putting in there, but also the reason for the essay existing, okay? Well, let's talk about that shape first of all. Why is it shaped like that? Why is it an upside down triangle? Well, a lot of it has to do with what's going on at the top as opposed to what's going on at the bottom. Notice that it's wider at the top, and then as you work your way down, it gets narrower, narrower, narrower. There's a reason for that, because actually the kind of information that you're putting in at the top is very broad, it's very wide, it's very general, okay? As opposed to the bottom of it, which is incredibly specific. It's a point, right? It's pointing to something. That point is your thesis statement. So that's the easy part, because if you know your thesis statement, well, it's going to go right there, okay? This is what your essay's about. This is the sentence that holds the whole thing together. Well, then what is all this stuff here? Well, it's information that's leading us into that thesis statement. You don't just start an essay saying, this is what my essay is about, right? That's kind of boring. And it kind of takes the surprise and the fun out of it too. It's a lot more interesting for your reader if you lead them. You're the narrator, you're the author here. Your job is to lead these people through a story. So that's where you start doing that, right at the beginning. Okay, so if this is very broad information and this is very specific information, how do we start that broad information, all right? Well, you've got some choices. If you've ever heard this term, attention getter or attention grabber, the attention getter is a statement that makes your reader want to keep reading. And it's not the easiest thing in the world to do, and I think that's why people think the introduction is difficult. How the heck do I get my reader's attention? How the heck do I make my reader want to keep reading this essay that I'm writing? Well, as it happens, there are some models that you can follow, okay? And they're really good ways of getting attention and also of kind of introducing the idea of what this thesis statement is. Here's what I mean by that. I'm going to give you 6 different ways that you can get somebody's attention, okay? The first technique you can use is to provide some background information. Background information is just like what it sounds. It's just information. It's explaining something. So if, for example, you're about to write an essay on something that's a little bit tedious, a little bit detailed, a little bit difficult to understand, well then it's kind of your job to bring your reader up to speed, basically. Okay, you got to give them some background information, explain what this thing is. Background information could be data. It could be a little tiny lesson, a little explanation of what this thing is. That's background information. Just think of it as teaching your reader about something, okay? If I was going to write a paper about, let's say, drunk driving, okay? I'm going to write a paper about drunk driving, and maybe a specific aspect of drunk driving, teenage drunk driving. I could start with data. I could say that 27% of all teens will drive while inebriated at some point during their teenage lives. I just made that up, okay? But if I looked that up and actually found that percentage, that would be a great attention getter, okay? That's a really good way to get someone's attention, because that's kind of shocking, you know? If it really is something like that, a large number like that, that's gonna get their attention and make them wanna keep reading. Background information could also just teach your reader about something. If there's really something about teenage drunk driving that I could write that would get my reader's attention, then I'm teaching them, basically, okay? I'm giving them the background information so that they're ready to understand whatever it is my thesis is going to be about. An anecdote is a story, basically, and it's a true story. It could have happened to you, or it could have happened to someone you know. But it's a really good way to draw your reader into this essay. Like I said, you get to be creative in an introduction, and an anecdote it's hard to say, is about as creative as you can be, because it's a story. You're writing a story, right? If I'm writing my paper on teenage drunk driving, I can tell an anecdote about an experience I had with it. When I was 18 years old, my buddy and I went to the movies, and it turns out he had been drinking a little bit, and I didn't know that at the time, and I thought he was driving kind of weird, and we had a very close call, and blah, 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 blah. I'm telling you this story, a personal anecdote about something that happened to me, my brush with teenage drunk driving, which is my thesis statement. I'm starting with a story about how I was affected by it. My friend was driving drunk, and I didn't know that, and we had a very close call, and we almost got into an accident, and it could have been a lot worse. These are all the details of the story that make it more interesting. That's an anecdote. Dialogue is a conversation. It's just two people speaking, basically, okay? It's a really good way to introduce a topic, because it's kind of sneaky. Your reader doesn't necessarily know where you're going, and so you can make it as interesting as you want, as long as it connects somehow to the main idea. Whatever your thesis statement is going to be about, if the dialogue covers that, it's a great way to introduce a topic. Okay, my brother and I were having a conversation, and my brother said, "Dan, you're really terrible at saving money. I notice you buy lots of nice things with your money as soon as you get your paycheck." And I said, "Yeah, I like to enjoy it. I like to enjoy life." And he said, "Well, you ought to consider where that money's going, and if it's going to be there for you when you get older." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And he said, blah, 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 blah. I'm just making this up again. It's not true, okay? But the point is, I'm taking a conversation that my brother and I supposedly had about saving money. Let's say that my essay was going to be about investing your money for the future, okay? That was a great way to start it, because it's just a conversation, a casual conversation that I'm having with my brother about saving money, right? But really, it's introducing the idea of investing your money and having a nest egg for when you're older. So the dialogue introduced that idea. Now, an analogy is a comparison. It's comparing this thing to this thing. They're analogous to each other, okay? They're alike, they're similar, they're close. That's what an analogy is. An analogy, I find, is a great way to introduce something that's complex or difficult to understand. Like if I were going to write an essay about being a marine biologist. Okay. Being a marine biologist is somewhat like being a child who's visiting the aquarium for the first time. They both have a lot of questions. They both see things that are very interesting to them that they want to understand more deeply. They both are very overwhelmed by all the beauty that the undersea world has to offer, blah, 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 blah. You see where I'm going with this? Now, here was the analogy. I'm taking this field of marine biology and I'm comparing it to a little kid who's visiting the aquarium for the first time. And because that's easy to understand, I'm using that to introduce the idea of something that's not so easy to understand. Marine biology is a very complex science, okay? So the analogy is using something simple to explain or introduce something that's not so simple, but in a simple way, a way that you can understand it. I can definitely understand what that little kid is feeling going on a field trip to the aquarium for the first time, okay? That's how an analogy works. I really like scenarios, and I think I tended to write them a lot when I was a student because they were more fun for me. Because I like to write fiction, you can get away with that in a scenario. A scenario is kind of like an anecdote. There's that word again. Damn, I have such a hard time saying that. Anecdote. They're both stories. An anecdote is supposed to be a true story. That's what makes it an anecdote. God dang. The fact that it happened to you, it's a story that happened to you, is what makes it an anecdote, okay? A scenario, you can totally make it up if you want to. It's still a story, okay? Imagine a woman is driving home after work. It's late at night. She's in a very rural area. There aren't too many street lights out on the street. And as she's driving, she notices in her rearview mirror, a pair of headlights appear over the horizon. She doesn't think much of it, but within a couple of minutes, she sees that those headlights are very quickly getting closer and closer. And she's already driving the speed limit. So this guy must be going really fast approaching her. And as the headlights get closer and closer, she gets more and more nervous. And she puts on a little bit of a speed. But then she finds that the headlights are also putting on some speed. And she's really wondering, what's this about? Okay, this is a scenario, okay? I'm painting a picture basically. I'm creating this story, and somehow it's going to relate to whatever it is that my essay is about. So if my thesis is something about something scary that can happen to you when you're alone out at night, then that would totally set up the situation. It doesn't have to be true, okay? Just the fact that I'm telling a story is hopefully drawing in my reader, and they're going to want to keep reading. Where is this guy going with this? Why is he talking about this woman driving home alone at night with a pair of headlights following her? Well, because I'm using the emotion of this story to draw in the reader, because there's going to be some emotion in my real story too. Okay, I'm not giving away the real story yet. I'm making up another story that's similar to draw them in, and then when I get to my thesis statement, that's where I'm going to introduce the real story, which is very much like that scenario. Startling information. I saved this one for last because it's not necessarily a separate category. In a way, it encompasses all of these things, but it's a reminder that you should be interesting, okay? Whatever it is you start with, if it's interesting, then that's an attention getter, okay? That's what makes people want to keep reading. So any one of these could be startling info. It takes a little bit of digging, research to find it, because it's got to be true. You can't just make it up, okay? It'd be really easy to make it up. And I guess if you really want to make it up, then maybe scenario is the one you should go with. But it's even more powerful if it's true. If I were to tell you that, do you realize that people in South America, 28% of all people who live in South America will get bitten by a vampire bat at some point in their lives? Pretty startling, right? Well, it's complete bull. I just made that up too. And you shouldn't make it up. But the point is, what if that were true? What if in my research I found out that vampire bats are a really huge problem in South America? That would be a great way to start an essay. I would definitely want to read that essay having seen that sentence as the very first sentence in my introduction. Don't make it up. It's got to be true, okay? For the purposes of explaining, I made it up. But you can see how that would be startling if it were true. So it does require some research. You want it to be true. But if it's something that people haven't heard before, if it's something, a brand new information that's really hard to believe, that's startling. That's information that gets people to want to read this thing. Okay, that's definitely an attention grabber. So any one of these could be startling. Any background information that's new to them might be startling. Okay, you can make the dialogue startling, the anecdote can be startling, the analogy can be startling. Maybe startling isn't the only word that you can use. Interesting would work there too. Okay, if it's really, really interesting, then that's a great way to introduce your topic. Now, here's the point here, okay? An introduction, I would argue, might be the most important paragraph in your essay. Not only does it contain the thesis, which is the main idea, which is what your entire essay is about, but it's also telling your reader, you're in good hands. I'm going to tell you an interesting story, or I'm going to give you some really good information that's useful for you. This is your chance to do that, this paragraph, all right? The point is, when you write an introduction, you want it to be a badass introduction. What does badass mean? It means it's cool. It means it's awesome. It means this thing is excellent. You want to put that much work into it, okay? Put a lot of work into your introduction, because if it's a badass introduction, people are going to want to read it, and they're going to stick with this until they get to the very last paragraph. That's a badass introduction. So what all this means for you, this is a very long-winded way of saying, coming up with that very first sentence, that attention getter, it is your first sentence, all right? That's why it's an attention getter, because it's the very first sentence that your reader sees. It's the very first thing they see. So you want to get their attention right from the beginning, all right? That's what that does. Okay, so I've got my attention getter at the top. I've got my thesis statement at the bottom. What the heck goes over in here? How do I fill in that middle? Well, basically think of it as a transition, okay? It's a transition from this sentence to this sentence. And there really is no one way to do that. There's 1,000,001 ways to do that. This is where you have to be creative, okay? So if I started with any one of these, if I started with background information, okay, that sentence gave you some background information. I'm teaching my reader about something. I'm just basically making a smooth transition from this background information into this thesis statement. It's up to you. How do you do that? Okay, you have to decide that. You have to invent how to connect these things together. If I had an analogy, okay, if I was comparing this thing to this thing, I would just expand on it. Okay, I started by talking about this little kid going to the aquarium. I'm going to keep talking about it until I make my way into just talking about marine biology, okay? It's just a smooth transition from one to the next. All of these are working that way, and all of them, that is what's going on in that middle section of your introductory paragraph. You don't want to have just one sentence that's an attention grabber and boom, there's my thesis statement. That's too jarring for your reader. You got to ease them into it, okay? You might as well just be giving them your thesis statement and saying, well, here it is, here's what it is. No, that's not very fun or interesting to read, okay? Gradually work your way into it. That's what the middle of this is. You're going from very broad information, and all of these are pretty broad information, and you're working your way down to the thesis statement, which is very specific information. That's the introduction. That leaves us with the concluding paragraph, the conclusion of your essay. All right? Look at the shape of it. Whereas this was an upside down triangle pointing downward, this one's a right side up triangle pointing upward. Okay? Now, remember with this one, we started very broad and we got more and more specific until we got to the thesis statement. It's the opposite here. Very, very focused, very narrow topic that gets broader and broader and broader. So in the easiest way of understanding this, it's the opposite of the introduction. It's doing the opposite, okay? It's starting with specific information and getting broader. Now, what does that mean? What it really means is a restatement of whatever your main idea is, okay? You could think of it as the thesis statement. You could think of it as a restatement of your thesis statement. Now, don't fall into the trap of simply rewriting your thesis statement. Don't take this part right here and then just plug it in right in there, because that's boring. We've already read your thesis statement. We don't want to see the same sentence again. However, there's nothing wrong with reminding us of what the main idea was. Okay, so if you want to restate the thesis statement in a new way, you can absolutely do that right there. That's a totally legitimate way to start your concluding paragraph, all right? Just don't rubber stamp it, boom, boom. That's boring. But rewrite the idea. Remind us of what that main idea was. That's what's going at the top of this pyramid right here, okay? So what was the main idea? Tell us again. Now, what's the rest of this stuff? Well, think of it this way. The real job of a conclusion is not only to remind us of what we just read, but it tells us why it matters. In fact, as a reader, when I look at the conclusion, I'm now thinking, so what? Why should I care? Your job in the conclusion is to tell me why I should care, okay? Turn it on me. Why is it important to me? That's what a conclusion should be doing. So tell your reader, it's your argument, it's your story. You tell us why this is important, okay? Why does it matter? You tell us. That's what's going on at the bottom here, okay? So basically, you've got your main idea showing up again, a restatement of the thesis statement, and all the rest of this getting broader and broader means you're now turning it on us and giving us the bigger picture. What does it mean for me? What does it mean for the world at large? That's a big idea, isn't it? Well, that's where the big idea goes. Why does this matter to all of us? That's a big idea. That's it. That's what the conclusion does, all right? So you're restating your main idea, you're reminding us what it is, and then you're explaining to us why it's so important, why I should care. That's what goes in there, okay? That's one way of thinking of what a conclusion does. And that's it. That's the overall structure, okay? Introduction. In our case, this time we've got 3 body paragraphs because we happen to have 3 parts, beginning, middle, and end, and then a concluding paragraph. And that's it. Now, for today, that's what I want you to work on. Today, I want you to write these 2 paragraphs, okay? Both of them. Maybe use one of these guys. Now, this is a simplified lecture for the introduction, okay? There's obviously more ways than this to start an introduction, but if you find that you're getting stuck, if you're getting writer's block and you're looking at a blank screen and you just can't figure out how to start this thing, pick any one of these. Any one of these 6 will work for you. Any of them will work. No kidding, okay? Pick one and go with it. And find a sentence and just start with that sentence and see where it takes you. Once you get that one sentence down, the rest of it usually just follows suit, okay? The pieces just fit together like a puzzle, like those sentence strips that we were putting together. Once you got that first sentence, it kind of gives you a plan for the rest of it. So try it out. If you're stuck, try one of these guys, okay? Any one of them, and see how that works for you. So that's it for today. We're working on these 2 paragraphs. Hopefully you're done with these. You really ought to be by now, okay? We're going to be working more and more quickly as we work through these next couple of weeks. We got a lot of work we still have to do. Just as a reminder, your thesis statement this time has to have 3 parts to it. Who, what, and why. Don't forget that. Whatever this sentence is, it tells us who you interviewed, what happened to them, and why was it significant. Now remember, don't tell me why it happened. I can figure that out by myself. Why is it significant? That's the why, okay? And if you don't know why it's significant, then ask yourself, what was the lesson learned? And if you don't know that, you need to ask the person, okay? Don't make it up. What was the lesson that they learned by going through this? That's what's tying this whole paper together, okay? That's what's going to show up again in this concluding paragraph, okay? And then you're going to explain to us why that lesson is important to us as well. That's what goes in the rest of that conclusion. So that's it for today, all right? Work on those 2 paragraphs. And I'm not giving you a hard due date yet, but I do today want you to work on those 2 paragraphs, okay? Tomorrow, we're going to start talking about a due date, and we're going to start talking about the next essay. We're going to go right into it, okay? So work on those 2 paragraphs, and for the next lecture, we're going to start talking about MLA format, okay? We're still doing a rough draft, but we're going to introduce that idea, and we're going to talk about what that actually means, all right? So stay tuned, be safe, and I will touch base with you tomorrow.